Hey, this is Adam Blackstar, and yes, I am wearing a headband like a girl, and it's great to be with you again. It's been a couple weeks. Hope everyone had a happy holiday season, and that you didn't have too many fights with your relatives about superstitious beliefs. Um, I had a good holiday season, a Merry Christmas. I'm not afraid to say that. But I have been sick too. That's been the bad part of it. I've had like the worst case of flu as far back as I can remember, even like 3 days of feverish and just spending a lot of time in bed. The good side of that is that I was able to study some different subjects that I've been wanting to get to and watch some really good documentaries on YouTube and just came up with some different topics I wanted to make videos about. And this is the first day really that my voice has been decent enough to be able to make a video without just gagging all over, well, you, my audience. But the topic I wanted to talk about today is not my hair accessory, but prayer and confirmation bias. I thought that would make an interesting topic. What's interesting is that even though I am an atheist now, I can still very much see the world through the glasses, through the worldview of a Christian believer. That hasn't changed at all. In fact, when I receive information, I can slip into either worldview very easily. Naturally, atheism is my default now, but many times I will reflect on how I would have received that information if I was still a Christian believer. And confirmation bias ties heavily into that. So I'm going to go ahead and define confirmation bias. There might be someone out there watching who has not heard of this before. Confirmation bias is the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theories. So a lot of times religious people get accused by atheists of being dishonest. And there is certainly a great deal of dishonesty that goes along with belief in what cannot be corroborated. But at the same time, I don't really think that theists know or they don't realize that they're being dishonest. They might not understand, or they might not be able to answer for their beliefs, but they do not see that as dishonesty. They just see that as them not being a good defender of the truth. I can say that because that was my position when I was a Christian. I never would have considered myself dishonest, but there was so much confirmation bias tied into my beliefs and so much just stubbornness. I didn't recognize it as that. But that's what it was. And really, that's what confirmation bias is. It means that no matter what new information you learn, it because of the filter that you put it through, it loses the potential to be able to move you from your position. Your mind can't be changed no matter what information you receive, no matter what you learn, no matter how much it would seem to contradict your position. You can't be moved from that position because you just recycle that information in a way that will confirm the beliefs that you want to have. So I can think of many examples from my Christian life of confirmation bias. My prayer life, just in general. When I would pray, I never really had, I mean, I'll just talk about toward the end of my Christianity. I got to the place where I didn't really expect the things that I prayed for to happen, at least not the way that I prayed for them. And I didn't see that as me losing faith. I actually saw it as me gaining trust in Yahweh, God. Because I saw it as that God has a specific will, a specific goal in mind, and that I merely needed to be in alignment with what God wanted to do. So the idea of me going out and praying for God to change something didn't make any sense to me. Now, at the same time, I knew that I was supposed to pray. I knew that that didn't excuse me from communicating with God. But I just started to see God instead of like a genie in a bottle who I summon up when I'm having a problem to give me three wishes. I just started seeing God as like my father, or like a friend who I could talk to about my problems and just express my anxiety, and there would be some comfort derived from this. I would feel as though just discussing this with God was unloading a burden from myself. And many times I would ask for a specific thing, but I never asked in such a way that was like, this is what I want, and if I don't get this exact thing, then that means you don't care about me and you're not listening, or you're not real. I would ask for that thing, but I would often qualify it. And I would say, but if that's not your will, or your plan is greater than mine, so I feel foolish even asking for anything. Now, on the times that my prayers got answered, which it seemed like that didn't happen very often, or maybe even at all. I can't think of any specific instance, and there must have been one. There must have been one where the situation resolved itself exactly the way that I prayed. Now, of course, that doesn't mean to me that my prayer was answered, because there's so many more examples of things not turning out the way that I prayed for them to be. But when things turned out the way I prayed, I just considered that as not that God changed his mind or said, oh, well, that guy prayed, so now I've got to reroute everything, and I've got to change what I'm doing because this guy prayed. I didn't see it that way. I saw it as that I'm simply in tune enough with God that I knew what to pray for. And what I prayed for was just what God wanted to do anyway. But again, that didn't happen very often. What usually happened was the situation resolved itself, but it just resolved itself differently, a little differently than I wanted it to. Most of the time, the way it resolved itself was just as good as what I wanted. Maybe it didn't get me out of the thing that I wanted to get out of, but once I had gone through that situation, I was able to look back on it and say that, well, there was a plan here, and it was actually better that I went through that than God allowing me to escape, because now I'm better for having experienced that. So the situation resolved itself not the way I asked, but still, I gave the credit to God. It was like, God had a plan, and his plan was just different. My ways are not God's ways. God's ways are not my ways. And I just trust God, and everything's great. Look what the Lord has done. And then there were those cases where it just seemed like the situation just got progressively worse. And it seemed like there was no resolution, or it seemed like it just didn't go in a way that ended up suiting me at all. And I kind of went through the ringer. But again, I never looked back from that and said, you know what, God just really didn't answer my prayers this time. God ignored me, and he put me through hell, and so I'm just mad at him now. Or And that never, likewise, it never caused me to question that God existed. What I would say instead is that, well, there was a lesson to be learned here, and God's will was different than mine. My will was to get out of this or for it to be resolved in such and such way. God's will was that I go through this. And even though it was not fun, and even though it might have cost me something, uh, I could look at that and I could say, I could find things about it that I saw as benefiting me. Kind of like Nietzsche says, whatever does not kill you makes you stronger. It was sort of that kind of thing. Like, well, I am stronger for that experience, so I give God the credit. So there was nothing there. There was no way, no matter how that situation turned out, there was no way that I was going to blame God or think that God wasn't there or begin to question in any way. It only ever, always confirmed and strengthened my belief in God. So my beliefs became unfalsifiable in that way. And this is confirmation bias. Sometimes I've had Christians ask me, they're like, well, what happened to you? Or they'll accuse me of being mad at God or not getting something my way. And so I turned from God. And this, which this is another example of confirmation bias, I guess, that they are not able to accept the fact that I just found out that my belief was very dishonest, and that I finally identified confirmation bias, and I finally identified why this whole system of belief was just false. They're not able to accept that, so they have to turn that in such a way to make me to where I'm just this guy who's mad, who I just didn't get my way, so now I'm rebelling against God. I'm mad at him. That's not true. As I just explained, I had a very there was no way for me to be mad at God. God was right no matter what happened. My beliefs were right no matter what happened. It wasn't that. It was actually the fact that I just learned to recognize how this whole thing worked. I learned to recognize that dishonesty. I learned to recognize that mechanism that was propagating it and that was sustaining these fallacious beliefs. When I recognized my own dishonesty, when I recognized that this was not falsifiable, and that all of this was going on right here, that's when I walked away from it. And I never found a way to approach it again without having to basically lie to myself, without having to sacrifice my own integrity to do that. And, that's just not something that I am willing to compromise. I don't know how I could and really ever feel that belief was authentic. I don't think it's possible. There are other examples of confirmation bias that I encountered growing up. One of the best examples is like when somebody was sick in the church. Oftentimes, like let's say somebody had taken ill and it was a serious thing. Like maybe they were having to go in to have tests done. And because they were scared, they would call for the church to lay hands on them and pray. And people would pray, but nothing would happen. So, and that was generally, I never, in my 30-some years as a Christian, I never really saw anyone healed. And it's kind of like goes without saying, right? I never saw anything that I could honestly look at and say, well, that's an authentic, uh, undisputable case of someone being healed. Generally, and maybe in every case that I can think of, when someone claimed to be healed or when I witnessed healing, it was always in someone, uh, they had a backache or a neck ache or a knee ache or ankle ache or elbow ache. I mean, you get the point. Or their arthritis was really hurting, something like that. Some invisible type of ailment. Or they would be limping. And I remember one girl, she had a cast on her foot, and she'd come in with crutches. And her dad was a minister. And they brought her up and prayed for her. And she put her crutches down. But she was walking around, but she still had the cast on one foot. And they were going, praise God, she's healed. And it was like, well, how can you verify that? I mean, she's still limping around with this cast. She's just walking on the cast. I mean, it's like there's nothing there. And this was when I was still a believer. I was like, why is everyone so happy about this? I don't really see anything. How does she even know that she's healed? But like I said, generally it was always backaches or something. And I think that there is like a placebo effect sometimes that goes into prayer. One of the things is that people just so desperately want it to work that I think this placebo effect comes into play. And they really do legitimately think that they feel better. It's kind of like when you take medicine for the first time. And you take that medicine and you're sitting around and you're thinking, do I feel better? Do I feel better? Oh, I think I do. I think it's working. It's kind of that sort of thing. But I never saw anyone rise from the dead. I actually thought about trying to bring someone back from the dead at a funeral once. No, I'm not kidding. That's a separate video. I'm glad I didn't try that, okay? Wow, I was wacko. But anyway, that's scary right there. But anyway, yeah, I never saw anyone regrow a limb. I never saw anyone who was blind be not blind. I never saw anything like that. I did know some people, not firsthand, but I heard some stories where somebody like had cancer, but they prayed and then they went into the doctor and they said, your cancer's gone! Hallelujah. I heard that story a lot, actually. But we know that cancer goes into remission all the time. And many times those people's cancer would come back. So, too bad. But when these sick people would call for the church to pray for them, usually they would end up going to the doctor for these tests anyway. So that doesn't demonstrate a lot of faith that they come and have prayer, but then they still go and have these tests run. If they were really faithful, they wouldn't need to go run the tests, right? They'd go and have the tests and the doctor would confirm that, yes, they have cancer or whatever. So at that point, they would start they might go in for surgery. And so it's interesting because it was rare for anyone to ever say, well, that person is not leaving it to God. They are going in for surgery. That means they don't trust God. They don't think God's going to work. No, it was always something like, well, God, he can heal miraculously, but most of the time he heals through doctors because that's how God has chosen to heal in the 21st century, is God has given doctors the skills needed to do this. So if the person gets better, we praise God because that was really God doing surgery right there. I can only imagine how these doctors feel who actually they take all the time and out of their life to study, to go to medical school, to learn how to help people, only for some bunch of ignorant jackasses to give credit for everything they do to God. I can only imagine how that feels. I would say that might get a little bit frustrating, but they're probably used to it by now. It might also help when they don't save the patient, and people then, instead of saying, well, God was asleep, he didn't get it done, or our prayers failed. No, they say that, no, God was listening. He just gave them complete healing. And complete healing, as we know, is that he took them on home to heaven and gave them their glorious body. That's complete, ultimate, the best kind of healing of all. So your dearly departed loved one is experiencing the ultimate healing, and they're looking down on us right now from heaven with Jesus hand in hand. So here we see, no matter what happened in this situation, you pray for the person, they're not healed. They go to the doctor, they're not cured. They die. No matter what happens, the prayers still worked. God's still in control. His will was still done. So there's no way that for anything to happen there to move people from that position. Again, confirmation bias. We're over 20 minutes now, but I wanted to go a little bit further, if you don't mind, and talk about some experiments that I have done in my life since becoming an atheist, some tests with prayer. When I was a Christian, my natural default behavior, anytime something occurred or something was looming that gave me anxiety, my default behavior was to pray about it, just to talk to God about it. Again, I felt like I was unloading the burden, and that by praying that I was crossing my T and dotting my I's, and that I was leaving it to God. So there was some comfort in doing that. And I've lived a pretty good life. Pretty much everything has ended up resolving itself. So I have no complaints about anything. I'm healthy and I'm happy, and so no problems at all. So when I became an atheist, there were people who told me that things were going to change in my life, that God was going to get my attention, that there was going to be bad things happen because that's God's way of humbling me and bringing me back to him and showing me that he's God. It's kind of a dick thing, though, because I really prayed hard for God to talk to me when I was walking away from faith the first time, when I was losing that belief. And that came before walking away from faith. I was losing that belief, and I wanted to hang on to it if it was real. And so I was asking God, just talk to me, just do something to show me that you're real, that you're really out there, and I'll reverse course, and I'll believe, and I'll be a minister, or whatever you want me to be. There was only silence on the other end. And I prayed this many times, and there was only ever total silence. There was no indication whatsoever that anyone was listening. So when somebody told me, or when different people told me that bad things were going to start happening to me, it was hard for me to really take it too seriously, because I just thought, well, why would God choose to ignore all my requests to talk to me, but then start afflicting me with plagues like ancient Egypt and Moses? So I just thought that was kind of silly. But I decided to test it nonetheless, because after I became an atheist, there were some things that happened. It was nothing like my house burned down or anything like that, but just different thing, no different than the things that would occur in your life if you were a believer. Just some negative things. But whereas in the past I would have gone and prayed about those things, I just decided to be very stubborn and not pray. And believe me, the urge was there sometimes. Not because I started believing, but because, again, these things bothered me enough that I just felt like, well, I'll just say a prayer just in case. Just in case God's up there waiting for me to pray, maybe I just better go ahead and say a prayer. But again, I didn't do that. I resisted that urge. So the point was to see how those situations resolved themselves without me praying. And in every single situation, it resolved itself perfectly fine without me saying a word of prayer. Everything came out just fine, no complaints, and I kept a positive attitude pretty much the whole time. So there, in the year and couple months since I've uh, lost my belief in God, there has been no discernible change in my life, in the amount of bad things that have happened, or in the way that those things have resolved themselves. Probably the worst thing that happened was my dog ran away. And I love this dog very much. This dog's like my best friend, which, yeah, my dog is a best friend. But my dog ran away, and she was gone for like 4 days, and it caused me a lot of heartache and distress. And again, in my mind, I'm thinking, is this God? Did God take my dog? Is God holding my dog hostage? Do I need to pray and get down on my knees? Is this God's way? I mean, because God is going right to my heart on this one. But again, I just thought, how absurd is that God would choose to talk to me by abducting my dog and holding my dog for ransom. I just couldn't even take it that seriously. And as it turned out, my dog was being held. My dog went to someone else's house, and they were holding my dog. And they saw a flyer that I posted, and they contacted me, and she said, "Hey, I got your dog." And so she brought me the dog, and it was no problem. Everything turned out well. I got the dog back like the night before Christmas Eve, so it was like it was like a Hallmark miracle type thing. And that is without any prayers being uttered. There was one other thing. I tell you, there was one time that I actually prayed. And I'll close this video out with this because I'm nearing the half-hour mark. I did something really stupid earlier this year. Actually, 2016, that would be last year. Last February, I did something, maybe the stupidest thing I've ever done. I decided to burn a brush pile on a windy day. And I do not consider myself a stupid person, but on that day I was really starting to reevaluate that a little bit, because I went out and I raked some leaves up on, and it was a small brush pile, but I just kind of raked some leaves up on top of it. And this was in a field with like dead leaves and dead weeds all over the place. And I dropped the match, and as soon as that match left my hand as it's falling, I knew that I'd made a mistake, because a big gust of wind came and it caught that fire at the same time that fire ignited those leaves. And that, I mean, there's just suddenly this wall of fire coming at me. And I'm there, and I've got a rake, and I'm trying to rake it out. I mean, this fire, it's getting big. I mean, it's getting big enough that I can't get close enough to it to actually do anything to it at this point. And so I remember I just started saying Jesus. And I wasn't saying it like as a curse. I was saying Jesus, like Jesus now. This, if there's ever been a time that I need you to demonstrate that you're real, please, please, now is the time, because this fire is rushing toward the woods, and I have neighbors over there. And I mean, I had only lived here for a short time, and I really didn't want to get the reputation of being the guy that like burned down half the town. So I'm calling 911, and while I'm doing that, I'm running back and forth with buckets of water because my hose wouldn't reach. And I'm dumping buckets of water. But I mean, I'm getting exhausted doing this, and I couldn't even run. I'm just walking with buckets of water. The fire department's on their way, but they're not going to get there soon enough to keep this fire from going into the woods. I mean, this was really stupid. So, finally, this fire, it burns away all of these weeds, and there's this dead tree that's laying down that I couldn't see because of the weeds. It's just laying down in a way that will intersect the fire as it's going toward the woods. And this tree, I mean, it was big enough that it was enough to slow down those flames so that I could get the water over there and dump the water on the flames. And, you know, the tree would have caught fire eventually, but it was just enough to slow him down just that much. And by the time that the fire department got there, I had already put out most of the fire myself, just with buckets of water. And so I just thought, you know, I prayed, I kept saying Jesus, and nothing happened. If it hadn't been for that tree laying there. And of course, again, there might be a Christian watching who's saying, well, that tree was there because God put it there. God foreknew that you would set this fire one day, so he caused that tree to rot and fall down well in advance of you setting that fire. So the lesson here to be learned is that God, just like that tree was there all the time, God's there all the time, and you only need to trust. That, again, an example of confirmation bias, that's what I would have thought, and that's what I would have testified to on a Sunday had I still been a believer. But knowing that that way of thinking is just, it's dishonest. There's no way, you know, I just got lucky enough that that tree was there. And since then, I have a terrible fear of causing fires. So I learned my lesson from that. I think that's all I want to say on this topic because, again, my video is starting to run a little bit long. Before I go, though, I just want to say thank you to everyone who has supported my channel. When I made my first video, it sat there for months with like 7 views, and I think 4 of them were mine. And when I made my second video, I think YouTube gave me a little help. It promoted the video for some reason, and I had thousands of views on that one before even the first few days. And I don't think that I'll be competing with Sam Harris anytime soon. But at the same time, it's cool that I can make these videos and that there's people out there who watch them and who comment. And so I appreciate your comments, and leave me some comments below on what you thought of this topic. Give me some examples of confirmation bias in your life. And thanks for watching, and I will catch you soon.